So hi everyone, and welcome to this conversation on Aidan's project about Design Studio, Questioning the Canon. For those of you who haven't met Aidan, he recently graduated from the University of Waterloo School of Architecture in September 2017. Throughout his 2 years spent in the MArch program, Aidan was interested in using physical models as tools for design rather than solely as representational tools. Through the process of designing a speculative proposition for a new public space within Toronto's Union Station, Aidan has developed an interest in large public and cultural buildings, as well as architectural sites located in urban networks. With previous work experience in Australia and the United Kingdom, he is now working in Toronto as an engineering architect, pursuing his architectural license. Currently, he plans to gain experience designing buildings in the urban, public, and social focus, while practicing at architectural design office. So welcome, and thank you for
Great. Thank you. So hi everyone, thanks for inviting me here to do this talk. It's great to kind of relive thesis and talk about some of the experiences I went through. Overall, this presentation is going to be pretty informal, and instead of kind of talking about the project as a kind of finished, completed object in a way, I'm going to talk about it through the process I went in designing it and working on it. So if it seems a bit disjointed and less clear, you can always just Google my abstract and it will probably be much more articulate. So the question of the exhibition, which is, I guess that's funny, it's right there. In a world of unprecedented possibilities and unforeseen brutalities, what can architectural education do? And specifically, how can design pedagogy address social, cultural, environmental, and economic challenges while retaining radical openness and experimentation? So I'm going to talk about briefly what I did before Masters, go through what I've done during Masters, and then I'll conclude what I've been up to in the last kind of 6 months since. So this was a project I worked on a year in between my undergrad and my master's. It's Trent University Student Center, and it was kind of a really great project to work on generally because students are an incredibly diverse user group. They're really passionate about what they're doing. They all want to be there. They're very politically engaged, and they're super active in a wide range of things. So this was a great building because it was full of all these different kinds of people and all these different kinds of programs. And so working on it, it made me realize that I really wanted to be an architect and that I wanted to go back and do my master's. And then going into master's, I knew I wanted to work on some kind of building, like a physical building for my thesis, and that I wanted it to be a cultural building and a building kind of within an urban center. So knowing all of those things, I arrived and I kind of started to search for this idea of what's invisible or what can go unnoticed within the kind of built realm, and how could architecture find a way to kind of explore what we kind of take for granted or for what's unseen. So I discovered or arrived at this site of Union Station, which is at the heart of downtown, and it's incredibly dense and ever kind of densifying urban center. And so that became the site, and then I went kind of through a process of uncovering it. And so it's currently going under a massive revitalization. This is kind of maybe what, depending on how old you are, what you might remember from Union Station, which is this kind of really funky 1960s, 70s aesthetic, full of payphones and cinnamon buns and this kind of big space where you can walk around. And it's this kind of open space that I always remembered as being really special about the station. But this is the kind of station that is proposed and that will soon be completed. So this is a new train shed above the station, and this is the kind of 2,000 square feet, 200,000 square feet of private leased space below that they're constructing below the entire station. So essentially they're building a giant high-end shopping mall below the station, and they're giving the lease over to one specific entity. And that lease also allows for the private leasing of all of the public spaces within the station. And this is kind of what I started to uncover after I started to visit the station and seeing it under construction and wondering what the future is going to be like. So it's a bit worrying, this kind of future that's going to happen. So this is, for example, this is one of the waiting rooms, which was this, you can see this very celebrated public space built by the city, operated by the city, and it's just a really generous space that you can go and wait for your train. And then now this kind of same space has been renovated and historically kind of fixed up, but it's become this kind of elaborate commercialized shopping place. So this is a kind of departing point for my thesis is how can I turn, or what kind of proposal could imagine transforming the station back away from a kind of capitalist, overrun, commercialized space towards a more democratic and public space. And so for me, like this, how many of you are in master's thesis right now? Can I just get a show of hands? Okay, so like, and the rest of you are in undergrad, or? Okay, great. So what's really interesting about Waterloo's master's thesis is, unlike most undergrad studios, and unlike the Trent Student Center, is that there's no kind of brief given. So for undergrad, you're kind of given a square footage, you're not given a budget, but you're given a size and a program. And same thing when I was working in practice, the client would give you kind of a list of rooms that you want, and then you kind of go about designing it. But at Waterloo, your kind of thesis, if you're designing a building, you kind of have to imagine your client and imagine the project and imagine the program before you even start designing it, which is kind of daunting, but I think a really special thing about the thesis curriculum at Waterloo. So this process of kind of arriving at my problem took like 6 months, which seems kind of crazy, but it was probably one of the most challenging parts to the whole project. So then further developing it, I narrowed my scope to this east wing of the station, so you can see the head house, and this became the site because it was formerly renovated, and it kind of presented itself as an opportune place where any intervention would kind of fit within the existing legal and historical frameworks of the site. After I kind of had this initial position, I ended up working through the process of working in 3D, both physically and digitally, whilst doing research. So it wasn't like this kind of process of researching a lot and then kind of parking that and then starting your design project. They both kind of work together. And as this process happened, I also was kind of refining that design problem. So what's interesting about thesis at Waterloo is that you can kind of take your design problem and shape it while you're shaping the project, so that at the end they kind of meet, hopefully, in the same place, roughly. So when I say working in 3D, so these are some sketch models that I did. As I was working through digitally, at certain points I would just kind of hit print, basically, and kind of laser cut a physical model. And then another key part of working in 3D is kind of looking at your precedents. So in undergrad, a prof would say like, hey, like, look at this precedent, and I'd Google it and be like, okay, cool, that's sweet, I'm gonna get back to work. But in thesis, like, you actually have the time to really get to know your precedents and really kind of look into them, like kind of looking at plenty of drawings and models and photographs of the project to kind of build a 3D model in your head of these kind of precedents. And for me, that was a really valuable exercise that I didn't really get in undergrad, is like really just spending like 2 days and just diving in. So for me, the precedents that were really pivotal in my design work were that of OMA, because their buildings are really big, they're often in urban settings, and they kind of have a lot of interesting questions in the way that they relate to the inside and the outside. And there's a lot of kind of writing about them. So for me, they were really useful. And then another one is kind of like re-examining those models. So I bought an endoscopic camera on Amazon, which is not for people use, as I read on the label, but it's this kind of camera on a string that you can like stick into models and take photographs. So I took some photographs of some of the sketch models as another way to kind of reanalyze what I've done and kind of look back into, like reinterpret the kind of work and see it from like another perspective. So by the end, this is a photograph, a cropped photo at my thesis defense. You kind of have this, if you work iteratively and you keep making physical models every time you have an idea, what's really valuable is you end up with this kind of collection of artifacts that can kind of really clearly explain your thinking process throughout the kind of design process. So you can see on the far side of the image is where I kind of started, which was this vague idea of having this rough plane come through the building. And then as it went through multiple iterations, it arrived at a more kind of finalized and resolved complete view. And then over here are some other study models. But together, you can really get a sense of like what the intentions were and what were some ways that you explored. So it's great to save those things. And then this is a photograph of the finished model that I had at the defense. So those sketch models were used in tandem with this larger site model, taking the smaller ones and putting them on. And this was kind of an ongoing design project in itself. It took like 1.5 years just to build the model that's over there. So like I would take a week off and like draw trains and put trains together while I was thinking, or off time, and kind of like a labor of love, that thing. But that's where that ended up. And then so whilst all of that 3D work and thinking through space was happening, I was also trying to research, so trying to blend the two of them together. And so this book, Publix and Counter-Publics, was really pivotal in trying to understand, like, okay, you've got this proposition of how to repoliticize this space, and like how can you, like how do you attack Union Station programmatically? So the rough premise was that since it's become a commercialized space and it's only attracting a very narrow group of the population with its high-end retail amenity, it's only really going to attract shoppers who can afford to shop them. So part of the proposal became, how can this project attract a diversity of Publix? So like, what are some other people that could be brought there to kind of rejig and kind of shift what the public of the station was and turn it into a more diverse and thus democratic kind of space. So, Publix and Counter-Publics is a book by Michael Warner, who's a queer theorist, and he introduces this term of the counter-public, which is this kind of name for a public that exists outside of the regular public. So it could be a group of people that might not necessarily feel welcome or feel kind of included in the overall public sphere, I guess. So what he explains is that it's fundamentally related to the ideas of what's public and what's private. So public relates to adulthood of the people, of citizenship and civic participation, and private relating to the individual and the family. So for a lot of people today and historically, their kind of lives were considered as relating to the private sphere, and that's kind of why they've been historically excluded from public participation. So the project kind of looked at how could you bring out these counter-publics back into more of a public light and kind of bring them into the public sphere as a way to generate kind of discussion and discourse and democratic exchange. So he has 7 principles, and I'll only read 3 of them. A public is self-organized, a public is a relation among strangers, and a public is constituted through mere attention. So there's other ones, but basically I took these rules to kind of interpret them. I tried to figure out how I could interpret these rules as spatially and architecturally. And I thought the number 4, a public is constituted through mere attention, was really interesting because it related to this idea of visibility and programs. So this idea of like publicity, privacy, counter-publicity, counter-privacy, and this idea of a range of scales of attention and how that could be used as an architectural tool to facilitate incorporating program into the station. So I kind of, after that, I discovered this exhibit at the AGO called Outsiders, and one of the main reasons it caught my eye is because it shares the same photo series as the cover of Publix and Counter-Publics. So I went to look at it, and basically they use the word outsiders, but you could also use the word counter-publics as a way, so this became a kind of an index. The exhibit was mostly portraits of these kind of groups or counter-publics that exist kind of in opposition to the public sphere. So there's transgendered people, there's queer people, there's marginalized people, there's racially marginalized people, and it became this kind of index of other people that exist in counter-public or counteraction to the public sphere. So this kind of became like a client for me. So trying to learn about these different kinds of publics and learning about not only what kind of programs would they benefit from spatially, but what kind of architectures would they inhabit, or what kind of architecture could best facilitate their needs and their engagement, whatever kind of engagement that may be with the public life or the public sphere of the station. So this is an example, Casa Susana. So this is an example of, Casa Susana was a place where Susana would invite all of their fellow cross-dresser friends to kind of play different roles in a safe space, and then they would photograph each other in this space. And then it's really interesting that the media that survived from this location like captures that kind of public-private kind of exchange. Like, so it's a private space, but they're taking photographs which are publicly released. So there's really kind of interesting overlaps in kind of breaking down the duality of public and private. And this is another photograph. Nan Golding is one of the photographers in this exhibit. And so this is a self-portrait that she did clearly suffering from abuse. And so what's really interesting about her photographs is that she takes photographs of really private, intimate moments, and then through those photographs, you're kind of given a window into the most private and intimate parts of people's lives. So I thought these kind of photographs were really interesting kind of inspiration to explore what a building could do. And this is another one, Lily, also taken at Casa Susana. So as I was kind of thinking of what the program could be, what the building could do, how it was addressing this kind of publicity and privacy of the programs, it got really complicated, and I was trying to figure out how to organize it spatially. And so I read a lot about political spaces, and so one of the key readings that I looked at was Richard Sennett's The Spaces of Democracy. And in this reading, which was a lecture, he talks about two main political typologies in ancient Athens. So the first is on the left here, which is the Agora, which is this kind of huge uniform public plain. It's a kind of the typology that's been adapted for civic squares. Nathan Phillips Square is kind of a great example of this. It's this kind of big flat plain where you can look out and kind of participate in all of these different democratic activities, and you can choose whether to engage or just spectate. And then the other one is the Knicks, which is this kind of assembly hall, and it's created by subverting the ground plane at an angle so that a group can kind of focus their attention on one kind of specific member. So while the left is this kind of open, kind of egalitarian space, the one on the right allows for focused and productive discussion. So they both have different advantages and disadvantages to them. And the one that he kind of mentions, but I used as a kind of primary typology, is the stoa, which is this space along the side of the agora where you can kind of sit back and kind of look out over this big plain and kind of choose to participate in it visually. But you also retain your privacy, and you kind of maintain a level of protection. And so historically, these spaces had other kind of smaller meeting rooms off of them that you could kind of hide away in. And so these three typologies became the kind of basis for the organization of the project. And so I kind of broke these programs up into 9 kind of variations of these types, and they're all kind of overlap and they overlay, and some are more, they're kind of all in between this kind of spectrum of stoa, Knicks, and agora. And so together they kind of formed this kind of nugget of really intense overlaid social programs that kind of nestles and is interconnected into the existing station. And so looking at the kind of fundamental proposal of how do you approach this, one kind of big move was, or one main criticism of the existing revitalization of Union Station is that it took a lot of pedestrian traffic away from the Great Hall, which is the main space of the building. And it deliberately diverted them downstairs into the basement so they would go by all the shopping malls and buy things. And so a lot of architects in Toronto thought this was a huge, big insult to the station because it's really undermining this Great Hall's public ability to perform as a public space. And so the kind of departure point for the form of the building was to integrate into the path network and propose a shortcut that extends over the station from the south and kind of directly deposits you in the center of the Great Hall. So it's bringing a lot of pedestrian traffic back to the Great Hall as a way to republicize it, but also providing a shortcut to the TTC station. So that's what you're seeing up at the north. So there's about 20,000 people who cross through Union Station, not to use the GO trains that are there, but just to go through the station to reach the TTC. So this would be a kind of a bridge over for them primarily, and also a kind of circulation spine that the rest of the project could kind of hang off of. So this is another diagram of what it would look like, kind of closer to what you're seeing there. And then so the rest of the project kind of hangs off of this kind of spine. And I'll just quickly go through these kind of 9 types, starting with the kind of agora spaces. So this is a kind of large assembly hall that would be the most of the east wing. It's left really open. It's this kind of ramped agora, so it's in between a Knicks and an agora because it's sloped, but you could imagine it as a place that has all kinds of activities taking place on it, and it's a really kind of a democratic, free public space that you could just kind of hang out in. It's connected to a roof, which is, again, another kind of civic square on the rooftop that you could, again, imagine all kinds of uses for. It connects to a kind of concourse agora that also spans across the train shed of the station. So these spaces take advantage of the low-rise reprieve that's been caused by the railway corridor as a way to basically kind of put a nice public park space on the top of the building. And then on the south, it would reach this kind of stadium agora, which is kind of conceptually meant to be an extension of the stadium seating at the ACC adjacent to it. And it would be able to become this kind of giant urban spectacle during events at the Raptors thing, what's it called? Like the Jurassic Park? Yeah. So it'd be this kind of like urban kind of performance space, but also like a Spanish Steps kind of just like a place to hang out. So there's this civic generosity in the agora spaces that suggest a more democratic participation. And then so the next one would be the stoas, and they kind of exist along the perimeters, so they between the kind of exterior heritage facades and the interior agora spaces, they occupy the space in between. So they're able to kind of look into the larger public spaces. This is like a public library that was seen as a way to circle around the kind of Great Hall, and as a way, so when this could be the future of Union Station as a kind of a rental space where you could kind of have a party in there if you can afford it. And so the public library that circulates it is meant to kind of undermine that privately operated kind of event. And it connects to this kind of counter-public library stoa, which is seen as this kind of like a library, but targeted for counter-public needs, so relating to media, like how circulation, maybe they make like protest posters in there, like, and leaving these kind of programs open so that the publics, which are self-organized, can kind of decide what happens within their spaces. And so this was kind of, the form was derived through a series of kind of like manipulations that ends up being this kind of combination of agora, stoa, and Knicks in this kind of exploded, stretched vertically oXXO. And then, so underneath that is this kind of resource stoa, which is a more private space where you could have really intimate meetings. You could have purely anonymous kind of exchanges there. It has its own entrance. And then there's across from that is this housing stoa, which would be kind of inserting a kind of a home into the station. So if you're homeless or in search of a home, you could either hang out on the ground floor overnight, or if you're looking for something more more permanent, you could kind of move up the floors of the building towards more stable, more kind of established, more intervention kind of level of home. So trying to accommodate a diversity of counter-publics in the building. And so the last one is the Knicks, which kind of slices through underneath the ramped agora, and it's this kind of assembly space that, again, like provides this kind of diversity of participation. So you can choose to be very publicly visible, you can kind of remain in the shadows, you can allow this kind of counter-publics, you're giving these counter-public groups a space to assemble while maintaining some sort of privacy if desired. That was the intention. So together you can imagine this kind of like overlapping, kind of overlaid levels of publicity, counter-publicity, proximity and adjacency, and visual relationships that overall accommodate like a diversity of needs. And so without getting too specific about what happens there and prescribing the kind of program to the space, instead I tried to imagine a diversity of kind of adjacencies and a diversity of architectures that in themselves would attract a diversity of publics. So you can see this kind of rough format happening with these kind of larger public spaces, the existing one of the Great Hall in plan here, and then the ramped agora with this circulation route cutting through it. And then these, at the top you see the housing, which is on the north facade, and then the south is the counter-public library. And then on the right here you can see the slope of the Knicks, which kind of goes alongside underneath the ramped agora in the center. And so all of this is kind of taking place interwoven into the excitement and busyness of Union Station, as a 250,000 people use the station a day. So you can imagine it being this really hyperactive, interconnected social fabric. Okay, and then so I'm getting close to the end. This is just a few photographs of the model. This is the model at my defense, and so that's kind of, it was a great tool to kind of explain this really complicated spatial project, like at a defense where it's a discussion. And so that's kind of where my thesis ended. And then I went back to work for Topology Architects in October, 5 days after defending, which I don't recommend that you do. Take a break. And I went back to Trent, and the student center that I worked on was finished, which was a really cool experience to see. But what was the coolest thing is in this building is a gender-neutral bathroom, and actually all of the bathrooms in this building are gender-neutral. And that's something that the students really fought for, and that we as the architects said, look, this is the students, this is their building, let's prove to the university that it can work. So that was kind of our role, is to really advocate for what the students want, because they're a very progressive, very queer-friendly institution, and then they ended up building them. So all of the buildings in this building are gender neutral, which is kind of amazing, and so it's an interesting kind of way to look at, well, you know, in my career, I might not, or we may not be able to imagine the kind of projects that we can in thesis, but then also like something really kind of insignificant or invisible as a bathroom can have a huge implication to a kind of counter-public. So I think like understanding the client and understanding the kind of small and subtle things that architecture can do can actually be really important. So I'll leave it there, and thanks.
So we are going to open up to a little conversation right now. Why don't I start with a little question regarding your presentation, Greg. Can you go back to that image where you have Adrian and looking at your model?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So when you mentioned how you engage in the practice of doing a lot of different test models that has to be very finished in order to actually dive into that space and take photos and actually experience what the atmosphere in the spaces. I know that a lot of universities also engage in that practice where they push the students to constantly try to produce some scale models for them to actually have that tangible tools that they can inspect, which is something that I see is pretty lacking in our school, where a lot of the times we just push for
the final
2 days
model.
after final, where you like put everything together as merely a presentation method. On the other hand, we are approaching the post-digital age that is kind of obsessed with collage image making. So in a sense, you make all these collages that represent the atmosphere that you kind of craft, maybe the human interactions that occur in that space, without actually involving the space itself. Right? It is kind of a placeless image that removes that atmosphere away from the physical building itself. Right? So I'm just wondering, how would you reimagine the curriculum to actually combine these two different methods of presentation together? One where you can actually place that image making into a physical, tangible space that directly relates my ideology to the physical construct of architecture.
Yeah, I think probably, maybe not surprisingly, but I advocate for making the physical models and using them as design tools. So what's great about the laser cutter, it's like this amazing machine that if you know how to use it, you can actually make a model like that like really quickly, and you can get really good at it. And I would say like treating it like a skill, just like learning Revit or Photoshop, like learning how to design, and then at a certain point, as fast as you can, take that design and putting it into a cut sheet and then cutting it, you know, and like not sweating. Like when I made some of those models, for example, like I would be designing up until a few hours before cutting. And then when I'm cutting, it's like, okay, you know what, this piece isn't gonna get cut, that one's gonna be done by hand. I'm gonna get the windows cut out because like that would take the longest part. But I would say, like the other thing about 3D modeling is that, and physical modeling is that there's a value to having something in your hands that you can see and that you can kind of move around. It's like an infinite number of perspectives just looking at it. And so there's a certain kind of understanding you get with like the scale, you know, the spatial qualities and their relationships just by having something in your hands. And then I would say like, if you have those, then it's really easy to combine you know, those kinds of photographs of a model, or collaging actually with the models themselves, like by cutting out like people or cutting out kind of other images and putting them in the physical model themselves, as like, so the model is a physical collage. Like there's all sorts of opportunities like to kind of blend the two together. But I would say like getting over the hurdle of like laser cutting and just like making something is probably the most important thing for me.
I also see it as like some sort of forced confrontation to if the space actually works, right? When you actually have to combine everything together and see them at once. Compared to an individual model, you're constantly only focusing on one space, not directly connected to the entire scope. Right? Yeah. And not covered behind that facade of the beautiful image that you're making, and actually confront if that space really functions as you desire.
Yeah, and I think like another interesting thing about the digital world versus the physical world is something that happened with AutoCAD is you could just keep zooming in and like, so like for example, if you have a plan, like when I was in undergrad, was really obsessed with like making sure the details would work in it. So I would like zoom into a window mullion and make sure the glass is meeting it, and then like get even closer, and then all of a sudden you wasted an hour because when you're printing that plan at 1 to 500, you can't even see the mullions. So it's like great, but there's something about with a physical model, you know, depending on what scale it is, you're kind of forced to go through the process by making it of trying to determine what is the best, like what's worth representing. So for one of the models that I made was 10 times smaller than this, and it was this big. And that was actually a much harder model to make because I had to be really selective. Like, do you put windows in it? Do you even put floor plates? And it ended up being this kind of massing model of those 9 typologies that were just these kind of shapes that fit together. And so going through that process of designing at various scales, it really kind of distills your idea. So for example, like after I presented that model to my committee, they said, okay, we can really clearly understand your architectural organization, like let's kind of work on that. There's an idea in this model that you should take back and put into the drawings that you've been working on. And there's a certain clarity and kind of clearness that you can get out of models that you can bring back into the project and ultimately make a much stronger, clearer argument for a building. Say.
I have a question about the process of some of this, because I think a lot of students sometimes see work with models or drawings or models, but I think there's a lot of your work that actually takes the model and overlaps and works between the two. Like maybe you could just, because I think some of those images, I remember it was like you would make a model, on a special camera, you would take a photo, you would draw on top of that, you would add, you know, all these layers of work. Maybe I'm just kind of interested in some of those processes.
Yeah, so I think like separating or trying to bridge the gap between like the digital world and the physical world, and for me like taking photographs was a kind of a way to do that, and also just getting really comfortable designing in 3D as well, which is I think like Rhino is your best friend, you know. I didn't use AutoCAD at all for this project, like technically speaking, so I just like working in 3D and then kind of making renderings like with the same angles that you're taking photographs, and then also something that I wanted to continue further is like examining the light qualities of the space, and that's something that's also really easy with physical models as well as renderings. So you can kind of take a model and like put a flashlight around it and kind of watch what happens, and then depending on how that works, you can take that back into the computer and do a kind of a simulation of like that's much more precise and specific. So for this model, for this one here, for example, that was something that I learned with my test models, is that when they're outside, like I realized that the space inside is actually really dark because in the existing building, there's a big light well, and it's actually a really big span. So then near towards the end, it was how do I kind of find a way to bring in light into these spaces, but also kind of contributing to the ideas. So physically, I ended up like just cutting out a few holes into some of the floor plates, like this one and that one there. So I tried to understand how those would work. I added like a skylight here, and then that was kind of doing the trick. And then so digitally, I tried another one where I kind of added this array of glass floor as a kind of a way to give kind of spill light kind of all over the space. And then I tested it out in the computer, and it kind of worked. And so then next time I made a model, it was really easy to laser cut that. So yeah, I think like going through the process and thinking of the atmosphere of the space as well, like when you're going through it. And like that's the kind of the most important thing, I think. Yeah.
So I don't know if you've just completely walked away or wanted to revisit this, or whether it's haunted you since you've done your, your final crit and presentation. Have you thought of, or actually have you approached anyone, to do with Union Station at all?
I made, when I first started, I interviewed Partisans, which is the architects who are designing the retail stuff at the basement. And they were actually, like, they're doing some really interesting work with like 3D technology and like really kind of advanced fabrication methods. But I don't know, like this kind of, it's kind of a very anarchist proposal to the existing stations that's there. Like it's very much in opposition or as a foil to the station that's ongoing.
Right, but somewhere between this ideal where the entire space is dedicated to this counter, sort of culture or community events and so on, and the polar opposite, which appears to be what is going to be built, perhaps the inclusion of a space or a couple of spaces or spaces that have the flexibility to host events of some nature and could be a compromise that could in fact personalize and make a deviation from the current plan. I think that's very exciting. I personally am very taken with what the concept of public spaces are as they disappear dramatically, certainly in the city of Toronto, and how people are reacting to everything from small postage stamp parks to other interventions which are establishing a means for things. I went to see this Agora talk on Tuesday night about the principles of design. It was basically their jury for their awards, but they are from all over the world, and this very interesting architect from Mexico was there, and he talked about how he had decided he wasn't going to do anything for government again because he had this really terrible experience in Mexico City and so on, and then he was approached to do something in a slight, I don't know that, couldn't quite understand if it was a suburb of Mexico City or if it's a smaller city, and it is a Philharmonic concert hall, but he was asked and he insisted, like he got to choose one of 3 sites and worked with the city council, the mayor in particular, and he insisted on including some derelict areas around it to make sure that there were things that people from the city could connect with, and including they project every single concert there, they project on the outside of the wall so people can, come for free and see that. And they also have on the top of it a kind of bar club thing that's open like till 2 o'clock in the morning, and people can go right up there and have nothing to do with the Philharmonic.
Yeah. And
it's taken an area which was very neglected and made it habitable, and has turned out to be hugely popular. And it just really struck me about these public spaces and how people don't even realize how much they're yearning for them until you have a small opportunity for one, and people just gravitate like crazy because there's such a dearth of them. I really am taken with this whole thing, and it pains me when I see what's probably happening there and what even a portion of this intervention could make such a difference?
Yeah, I think it's definitely like moving forward into practice. It's kind of the challenge like of advocating for space is huge. So, for example, which is why it's really interesting, and a really interesting site is because when everyone thinks of the revitalization, they're thinking of the $800 million price tag, which is ever increasing. So the kind of public eye on this building is that it's cost a fortune, it's an economic disaster, and that's why like I think it's really interesting to do a polemical proposition, whereas you say like, okay, well, but what if we spent another $1 billion on it, which I know would like never happen, but also as a way to kind of, advocate for public space. And I think that's something that, as architects, we really take for granted and we kind of value it. But understanding that project, which sounds like a fantastic kind of project, and so understanding too that architecture isn't just about the kind of image or the rendering or the flashiness, but it involves, making sure that it's democratic and egalitarian from its principles, which is, I think, the biggest criticism I have of the development of Union Station that's happening currently, which isn't necessarily the architect's fault, but it's the way that the city has basically used the privatization of their own public building to finance its renovation. Whereas I feel like in a more democratic government, it would be public money that's used to put back into its own building. It would retain ownership, and it would be the managing and the operator, as opposed to...
If they were to integrate some aspects of this, they would, I think, be paid back in spades, because the number of people who would come and actually use it and feel like they were stakeholders in Union Station, which is a building that you absolutely never go to unless you have to, but that it would become a destination, that there would be these events, and there is a history. There has been some theater, and there has been some dance, and there has been some other things take place in Union Station. Of course, in the old, configuration. Anyway, it's really grabbed me, and I think you may be exhausted and, fed up with it, but I think it's very much something worth pursuing, if not here, then in future. Certainly as you progress in your own career, now you're working for someone, you may not always be, or you may gravitate up in that organization and have a say in the kinds of things. But I think as we take every square inch and put a condo or, various other things in here, and people are thirsting for opportunities for things, the meaning is even more poignant. It's really, really great.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think what's very valuable in this project as well is the identification of the topologies that you quote from, which is Senate, the Agora, the Knicks, and the stoa. It comes back to when we look at precedents when we do studio, right? We can't really just pick and choose these build topology and say, oh, if I implement this in my project, it should bring the same effect. But at the end of the day, it's the identity of the topology and this connection with the broader environment, or even the interconnectedness between these topologies, the effect that it creates that when they bounce back and forth. And I think that's something when we look back at doing design studio, it feels like that should be what we're searching for when we're looking at precedent, when we study them. As you said, we can't really dive very deep in it, but maybe if we were to pick something rather than the glamorous side of it, we should really be trying to analyze it and take the core element of what makes this function the way it is and the way we see it in the photographs. That's just a comment.
Yeah, I think too, getting to know the backstory of any project, that was for me the most interesting kind of unraveling of Union Station. Is there's all these flashy, really there's a truss made of glass and steel, that's architecture, that's great, but understanding where the money comes from, who paid for it, What's it really doing? You know, kind of those backstories. So I don't know, in your undergraduate studio projects, like what kind of buildings are you working on this term? A library? And is that 1B or
1B.
Are there any third years here? Is it like downtown, like a urban setting, or? Okay, cool. Yeah. So like, this is something that I was totally oblivious to in undergrad, but when I was in 2A, we designed a hotel in Cambridge, which like everyone was kind of like, okay, we're looking at these really flashy, like Philippe Stark, like John Pawson, really, really high-end hospitality projects, which was like fascinating, and they're like the atmosphere that those designers create is really kind of amazing. But there was always a question that we had as whether this was the appropriate building in Cambridge. And looking back on it, it's like, well, there could have been more appropriate buildings, like a community center or a rec center or something downtown, so that you wouldn't need to pay a huge amount of money to go into it. And I think understanding the difference between, or the relationship between private and public money is something that becomes increasingly prevalent, like going into practice. So like the company I'm working for now, Topology Architects, for example, they did 60 Richmond, which is a housing co-op, and it was paid for by TCHC. And so you can see the building, and it has like a lot of really generous features about it because the city owns it. Their primary goal isn't to resell it for profit. They want to keep it as a great place to live. And then they've also done other condos, which are the primary goal is to sell off the units and generate a huge profit and to make a really flashy building that'll sell well. And so if you compare those two buildings, like one is 40 stories taller than the other, one has like these really generous kind of public gardens that you can share and grow your own food, and the other has private terraces that is, for people who live there who bought them to have like really nice parties on. So I think understanding, like not to say that private money is bad, but understanding that I think in most successful projects, it has to be this kind of territory that you navigate. And as architects, the Ontario Association of Architects, like we're a service, right? And we're a service to the community, and so we always are kind of have to advocate for what the public want, and public space, and advocating for that public money and the public side of every building to matter. And so I think like with a library, that's like a really kind of a dream project for an architect, because it's, there are these amazing spaces that can be super diverse. There's also so much flexibility, and they're becoming these kind of like community-like public space centers in a way that the traditional library typology wasn't. And so like moving forward, I'd say like that's a really valuable thing, is if not like every studio project you have the time to like kind of get into this whole advanced capitalism critique, but something to be aware of with everything you're working on is like where that money comes from, who's funding it, and then how is that, those primary forces, how is that going to shape how it ends up? I think it's really important. Yeah.
We as architects, do we have a big say in terms of bringing these sort of like public elements into privatized buildings?
I mean, like technically, like it doesn't say anywhere that it does. So technically, like there's no kind of clause that says the architect can overrule you. But if you look at really prominent architects in every city, in Toronto and other places, architects have the ability to be a voice of the built realm, and you can kind of generate, I don't know, at least I found if you believe in what you're doing, you can generate a lot of discussion and interest, and you can speak for the public. And although like you might not be able to legally overrule something, but you have a lot of, like, if you recognize it, there's a lot of potential to, make a difference and to kind of speak for that. And although like, yeah, it's kind of like, on one hand, when you go to work every day from 9 to 5, you don't feel like you're speaking like for the whole city. But on the other hand, like I think there are opportunities for that. And there's panels, there's like a healthy culture in Toronto, a design culture. And so it's not something that I would say you can do like right away, but it's something that I think you can definitely like work towards. I don't know, does anyone have any comments on that kind of question?
Well, I would just say that not all developers are equal, and there are people who you could cry till you're blue in the face, and they will not incorporate anything. But there are also others who will listen, and depending on what kind of case, and this is where it would be incumbent on you to build a case and say, if there is a retail element, if we have this other public aspect, it's going to bring people to feed your other thing. It's going to make it vital all the time instead of just sort of, it'll make events, it'll be all kinds of things, it'll be a dynamic thing that's going to drive what you want to happen and make your retailers happy and do all these other things. And there are a few enlightened developers who will consider these things, but it's, you have to be thinking about where it's going to hit them. What they want to know is about the money. You have to say, you know what, by doing some of these public things, it actually increases traffic and does all these things. And here's some examples of other buildings that have done that and why that works. So if you have that feeling, and the fellow I was talking about in Mexico, he said he didn't start out doing that, but he's now moved into that direction, and now he has clients coming to him who want these kinds of things. It's been a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, don't lose your idealism.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is like knowing that you like this project, for example, was kind of the most extreme kind of like entirely publicly funded building, and understanding that like the reality, like if it's a plausible kind of exercise, which this project was deliberately not, then there would be this kind of relationship or this balance between the two. And I think the architect, I think that might be the kind of answer of your question, is that the architect, they have the ability to kind of understand both, like how can you maximize profits from retail or office or whatever, or condos, whilst also contributing to the kind of life and the health of the public realm. And so maybe that's the role that the architect has, is the ability to understand how to win both in a project.
All right, we're going to wrap up, but thank you very much. And